Career Transitions is sponsored by and produced in cooperation with the Butler University Lacey School of Business graduate programs. For more information, visit butler.edu. Hi, and welcome to another edition of Career Transitions, a podcast designed to help you make the leap to that next job, the dream job, or launch a new career. I'm Eric Birch, and here with me, as always, a career coach and consultant to the stars of industry, Jonathan Jordan. Jonathan.
Eric, it's a terrific pleasure to be here with you tonight.
So what we're going to talk about is the interview and trying to do an interview and be part of an interview and be prepared for the interview that is leading the next century.
Yes.
We've all done interviews, obviously. If you've been in the workforce for any length of time, you've had at least 1, 2, 3, or in my case, several thousand. Has it changed at all in terms of how you approach an interview in the last few years? And is it changing, or is it in the process of changing?
Yes and no. The no part is that, surprisingly so, the interview fundamentally, in terms of preparation and delivery, is just about the same as it was 50 years ago. The change is that the demands today require that you lead an interview. There's no more following an interview or following the lead of an employer. The expectations, even for entry-level positions these days, let alone if you're a CEO and applying for a job through the interview process, you must lead the interview. And so tonight's broadcast is going to be biased toward helping you understand and giving you lots of tips on how to lead an interview in the 21st century.
So how would you define, just for a starting point, how would you define when one is leading an interview?
Well, number one, you want to anticipate the needs of the employer, whether this is a promotion and you're interviewing across in another discipline or your boss's bosses for an interview, just like, and the same for interviewing with a brand new company in perhaps a brand new market. You need to anticipate what their thinking is and what their needs are. And surprisingly enough, part of that is that anticipation in leading an interview in the 21st century is understanding that they are likely not to be prepared for you. They're not likely to be fully ready to interview you. They're certainly not likely to be as prepared as I'm going to suggest, and we're going to talk about tonight, in terms of being ready for this interview. My suggestion, my recommendation for those of you who are anxious to bury the competition is to be so ready and to lead the interview so well that you blow literally the employer away.
Is there, you can say you don't know or no, there's not any specific reason, but is there a reason why an employer is, we're talking about some fairly significant positions here that we're addressing, would not be prepared for any particular candidate?
Lots of reasons. Half of them particular or perhaps are traditional, that they just have run out of time. They've got 15 things that they were supposed to get done before the interview, and they just haven't had time. Their world is full of busy tasks, and surprisingly so, your interview or bringing you on board a new candidate is not at the top of their list in many cases. But there are some new things. Technology, for example, we have become over-reliant on technology to the point where we think that it will make up for our, and I'm speaking from the employer's perspective, lack of preparation, when in fact it doesn't. The internet is no excuse for not being prepared. And other things. The markets and companies are moving much faster these days in both hiring people and letting them go. Much more so than even a generation, and certainly 2 generations ago, where hiring and letting people go, adjusting to the market is what I'm trying to say, happened much slower. Today, it's happening much faster, and that speed is causing, in many cases, having a negative effect on the employer's ability to be prepared for it.
I think we're seeing a little bit of a shift as well in terms of the process getting to the interview that we may be talking about, that there's going to be those pre-interviews, if you will, with an HR person, a hiring manager perhaps, or someone even in between. And my experience has been recently that most of the upper level interviews that you're doing are not just one person. They're going to bring in 2 or 3.
Because of the increase in insurance liability, because of EEOC and other government agencies' demands on discrimination, diversity, and all kinds of things, most companies, large and small, are slowing down actually the interview process to try to make sure that all the boxes are checked. And it's often the case these days where a simple, even an entry-level position, you're going to be asked to have separate individual one-on-one interviews with 6 or 8 or 10 people. Much more heavy duty in some cases than in the past. Conversely, you're also going to have opportunities to have one 30-minute interview and you're hired. So it's a broader spectrum. The bell-shaped curve that used to be fairly narrow is much wider in terms of what to expect on an interview. It could be many interviews or it could be one. And you just won't know until you start in the process. But in all cases, again, let me get back to the theme of tonight. We are suggesting, I'm suggesting, you're suggesting that each job candidate be fully prepared to lead this interview process.
So how does that preparation start?
Well, the first thing to do is we assume now in the scheme of things that the organization, either a promotion or a brand new company, has indicated an interest in you. And even before an interview has been scheduled, let alone afterwards, there are 2 or 3 things that you need to do in preparation. Number one is to get on the internet and spend 1 hour, but no more, putting together a 1-page summary of key aspects of the company. Sales for the last 3 years, key executives, key employees' names, key vendor names, key customer names, anything that you could find on the internet that would either be available on their website or someone else's combination. Cut and paste all of that, put that under your masthead on a document, one side of one piece of paper only, and then print that off, put a copy in your portfolio, and then bring that with you to the interview. So that's number one. And why am I spending time talking about that? Because it happens to be the number one complaint still today from companies who interview, that they're concerned that job candidates don't know the company or anything about it of which they're interviewing. So don't make that mistake. Anticipate that this will be a concern, a question, box checking, if you will, that the company will be looking for whether you've taken time to know at least something about the company.
I don't think you can stress that too much, because it's very important to do that if you want to call it due diligence. But as a former investigative reporter, when I go into an interview with a company, I know more about that company than probably half the people that I'm interviewing with. And I think that's very important, because I use that, obviously, to be able to speak at least somewhat authoritatively.
Yes.
Thank you. Authoritatively about the company when you're in the middle of the interview, to really know what you're walking into. Not necessarily the company as a whole, but that's important to know what you're walking into, but also what might be the playing field, what might be the foundation for this interview. I look at who's had this job before. I look at who works there now. I Googled news. I have used business databases like Merchant to get the background financials on a company, in order to really understand what the situation is for this particular position that you're applying for, or that you're being interviewed for, or as well as just the company in general. You can find out things that will be very important, and when you're preparing for the interview, this kind of information will also give you fodder for answering the question, well, do you have any questions for us?
Absolutely. And as we've mentioned before, the expectations are heightened. It's not the same as it was a generation ago, where you came in with your hands folded in your lap and you were expected as a job candidate just to answer questions. No, it's different now. You're expected to have questions too, and you're expected to lead the interview. And one way to lead the interview is to do your homework sufficiently enough so that you can knock the employer's socks off in terms of at least a basic understanding of the company that you're interviewing with.
So we've determined that you're going to know everything about the company to the point of having worked there for years and years and years. What's the next step?
Okay, the next step is to, you may often, especially once the interview has been established and you have a date and a time and a place, you may want to call them back and ask them some questions. Number one, you may want to say, hey, what's the dress code? Now, the rule of thumb is you want to overdress. But really, in a perfect world, you would want to dress as others in the organization dress, so that you fit in their eyes, to someone who looks like they could work here. So if you find out through a quick phone call to HR or to your prospective boss, whoever set the meeting up, or maybe even a receptionist, and you find out that the dress code is business casual, then you know immediately that you don't need to wear a tie. In fact, wearing a tie and a suit, you would be obtuse. You would be looked at as someone, I don't know that they fit. They look like a preacher perhaps, but they don't look like somebody who would work here.
I have a story.
Okay.
Long ago, I was interviewing for a job at a radio station in Phoenix. At the time, I lived in Colorado. So I arrived for this interview. I was brought in for a couple of days to do interviews with the radio station management, excuse me, so the final interview includes the general manager. This is the vice president. He's the big man in charge of this particular radio group, and all he could do was smirk at me through the entire interview. And I finally looked at him and didn't say anything, and waiting for him to, and he goes, "I'm sorry, but we can always tell when people are coming in from a northern state for an interview because they're wearing a wool suit in June in Phoenix." And I was, and it was 100 degrees in the shade at that particular time, and that part of the year in Phoenix. And so, yeah, it's you not only need to know the room, but know where you are and how that's going to impact. Because I did, as you said, stick out.
A couple of quick comments about dress, and I'm not an expert on dress codes, and I'm not an expert on what men and women should wear, but let me give you a couple of quick tips, one for women and one for men. For women, less jewelry is better. For men, go out and buy a new long sleeve shirt with some starch to it. That kind of doesn't matter what trousers you wear and shoes and socks. We'll leave that up to you. But a shirt for a guy is the most important thing. And don't rely on an older shirt that might be frayed or not. Just spend the extra money to go out and buy a nice shirt or two that you're going to wear exclusively for an interview. Any particular thoughts, Eric, on anything else about dress code?
Well, I have always erred on the side of conservativeness in terms of wearing a suit and tie to an interview. But there are times when it's been perhaps, I have been told, actually, in an interview which was successful, that I was going to be hired, that's the last time you'll be wearing a suit in this job.
A couple of other quick things about the preparation or this phone call that you're going to make typically back to the employer just to get some things clarified. Ask them if you have to fill out a job application. Many firms will surprise you when you arrive 5 minutes before the interview that, oh, by the way, there's a half an hour that you need to take sitting, in a chair by yourself with a pencil and filling out a 3-page application. If you had a heads up beforehand, at least you would arrive enough time, at least half an hour ahead of time, so that you can fill this darn thing out. A lot of firms, for security reasons, don't allow you to start the interview until this darn employment application is filled out. What I recommend all my clients is just get a standard boilerplate one off the internet, print it out, fill it out, bring it with you so that you can just copy information that might not be at the top of your head onto the new employment form, job form, and be on your way. The last quick item is get directions if you're not familiar with the operation. And if it's a significant plant operation, you might have to get some specifics on which gate to come in. It might not be obvious, even from your GPS, on what the correct entrance is. So get as much information so that you are, it's as undifficult as possible, if that's such a word. And then finally, a quick tip is show up at least 15 minutes early, because you're liable to learn something by having just quick conversations with even the receptionist about the company and about the job. And if you have to fill out a job application form, make sure you're there at least a half an hour, perhaps 45 minutes early.
And not necessarily appropriate, but if there are multiple interviews going on the same day, if you're there early, you can see who your competition is.
Sure.
In some cases, and I've actually had that situation where I've seen people that were leaving, and they go, okay, that person is.
By the way,
up for the same job.
Eric and I have had this conversation, and I share this with most folks that I talk to. My interest is in having you do such a good job that you bury the competition, and I'm sincere about that. Some people flinch. Trying to be good and kind and just and whatever. In an interview, however, I want you to go for the jugular in as nice a way as you possibly can. But I want you to have the mindset of doing, again, such a good job, preparing so well, that you end up burying, literally, the competition.
So let's talk about what other preparation one might do other than a phone call and have a application form ready.
Sure. I want you to consider bringing your portfolio. In fact, if you've put together a portfolio, we've talked about this in another podcast, absolutely bring this along, because this will be a wonderful differentiator, and it will help lower your anxiety level in an interview unquestionably. Bring a dozen copies of your resume. Don't question about it, because in any meeting, whether it's one-on-one, and especially if it's in a group meeting, a group interview, you want to automatically reach into your briefcase or your portfolio and pull out and hand to each person a fresh copy of the resume. Don't even ask them whether they have one or not. You just assume that you have the latest copy and they need to have it. Most people, whether it's one-on-one or in a group of 6 or 8 people, will appreciate very much that they have a brand new, fresh copy of your resume. You'll also find out, by the way, when you're doing this, that you'll quickly figure out who's done their homework and actually looked at it, and those that have never seen it before, and that will help you in the interview as well.
So, anything else in terms of? I have one thing I wanted to address, but is there anything else off the top of your head in terms of written preparation?
Those are the key at an advanced level, and we might talk about this in another podcast. If you are beyond an entry level position, let me put that first. If this is also a job that you really want, that you think is a terrific fit, and you really want to blow the competition away, I want you to consider putting together a SWOT analysis. And very simply, very briefly, without going into detail, again, we probably will spend some time on another podcast talking about the SWOT analysis in more detail. It's simply a 4-box, one side of one piece of paper summary of 2 or 3 strengths, 2 or 3 weaknesses, 2 or 3 opportunities, and 2 or 3 threats that you have uncovered by doing some research that will probably take another hour or 2 beyond the 1 hour that you spent getting basic information about the company. And then you summarize that and bring that document with you too in your portfolio, and make sure that you take time in leading the discussion to pull that out and refer to one or two things that you found in one of these 4 boxes. You will blow them away, and just like you said a few minutes ago, Eric, you will now elevate the discussion in some cases beyond even the interviewer's knowledge about their own company.
This podcast is sponsored by and produced in cooperation with the Butler University Lacey School of Business graduate programs, a business school on the rise, experiencing tremendous growth in both enrollment and academic quality, the Andre Lacey School of Business at Butler University. It supports the long-term vision to foster further interaction between Butler students and the business community. Check out the growing list of graduate programs available through the Butler University Lacey School of Business by visiting butler.edu.
One of the things I think is something that's relatively new that I think people should be prepared for in terms of, and this is for interviews at whatever level, from entry level on up, and that is the STAR interview. And that's STAR, situation, task, action, and result. And this is a HR approved interview form where 2 or 3 of the interviewers will have been given 1 or 2 of these to ask you about. And then sometimes the companies will tell you, be prepared, we're doing a STAR interview and you can do this. But you should probably be prepared for it regardless, because you don't know what their situation might be. So if you've never heard of STAR before, they'll pose a situation. What would you do if you found yourself in this kind of situation? That's the situation. The task, what did you do? What was the task at hand? And the action, what action did you take? And what was the result? Mm-hmm. And this could be on any topic. Mm-hmm. And I had recently been told I was going to go through an interview, which there was going to be a STAR format, and I made sure that they understood that I knew what the STAR format was. And I put together 10 different situation, task, action, result from my experience and my previous professional experience, and had those ready.
May I interrupt? Audience, if you caught that, this is a wonderful way to bury the competition, to do this extra kinds of preparation that Eric just shared a story.
And it was helpful. And not only if you don't, and in most cases in the STAR interview process, they'll tell you that it's okay to stop and think. It's okay to read from notes. We like you to have notes. And so I walked in and I did not know what the situations were asked of, but I said, I figured out, okay, with 10, I'm pretty sure I'm going to be able to at least come close to anything that they were going to ask me. And I think I did. And I think I used like 3 of the 10. Of course, you'll have them for the next interview, certainly.
Sure. Good for you. Terrific.
And so I think that's a great way to be prepared for that type of interview. Even if they don't tell you in advance that they're doing a STAR, then you'd have that if somebody says, so tell me about when you do this. And in terms of management role, how do you deal with a problem employee? How would you react to that?
Some in our audience will think of the term behavioral question. Many STAR questions are behavioral questions. What would you do in a situation if you discovered that a coworker is committing some kind of fraud, right, or doing something dishonest, or what have you ever been in a situation where you've had violence in the workplace? What has been your response? And so these STAR responses are good preparation and good responses for those.
Okay, so anything else to do beforehand? Does that get you ready?
Those are the main items.
Okay. So once you're in the interview, how does one lead the interview once you're there and you're sitting across from a hiring manager, somebody from HR, and the person that is the direct report or direct supervisor, or even somebody from another area in the company that you might have to interact with, and they want to see how you do?
Think of each interview, whether it's one person and whether it's your future boss or HR or the president of the company, as a dance in 3 steps. And simply it's this: the first 5, 6, 7 minutes is kind of getting yourself organized, both in paperwork, especially if you have your portfolio, and a mindset to get ready for the interview that will start after 3 or 4 or 5 minutes. The second part is the actual interview, and we'll spend some time talking about how you're going to lead and manage the questions and the comments. And then the last part of this 3-part dance is the last 5 or 6 minutes, where you're spending time summarizing, wrapping up, and asking some appropriate questions about the interview process, so that when you walk away, you are feeling very different and much better prepared about the next days and weeks, and sometimes even months beyond the interview. So do you want to spend time, Eric, talking, kind of dissecting each one of those?
Sure.
Would that be helpful? The first 5 minutes, your job is to set the tone. And setting the tone, you're going to open up your portfolio. You're going to pull out 2 or 3 important documents, like your resume, like a job match. We've had one podcast talking about the job match document. Maybe even your SWOT analysis. Certainly your 1-page history of the company, and with some of your facts and figures, and put that out in front of you. It will be impressive as all get out. And you'll start the process, even in the first 5 minutes, of bearing the competition, because nobody else will do this. I have had way too many very senior people, including CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, who are convinced that they don't need to bring anything into an interview, or at the very most, 1 copy of their resume as a reference. Nonsense. You can't possibly remember the rich depth and breadth of your delightful stories, of which most people, even 25 or 30 years old, have 4 or 5 or 6 of them, by not having any documents in front of you. That's cruel and unusual punishment, to put so much pressure on your memory and the brain cells between your ears when you don't have pieces of paper to help remind you.
In a situation that's anxiety-ridden to begin with.
Absolutely, because you're given half an hour, 45 minutes, some cases more time, to state your case. And if the light's on, the microphone's on, if you don't do it in that time, they're going to say, and rightfully so, next.
I think in this way, it's not a situation where you can do too much. I mean, you can probably say too much. You could say, I deserve this job and you need to give me this job now. That probably would be inappropriate. But being prepared in this fashion and showing that you're very interested in this and you're very aware of your own experience and talents is certainly not something that's going to be misread.
And you're doing, again, you're anticipating their needs, and their needs are to find out as much about you, as deep as you possibly can go, in a half hour, 45 minutes, an hour. That's not a whole lot of time to tell a story of even someone who's 25 years old and has been in the workplace for 5 years, let alone somebody who's 50 or 55 or 60 and has spent 30 or 40 years with a rich hours and hours upon hours of stories to tell. You have to have these stories down so well that you can go anywhere the interviewer wants to take you, or equally important, where you want to take the interviewer in these documents before you.
I think you could call it a successful interview. Just one of the points that would make it a successful interview is if you were able, through the documentation, through your preparation, and through your conversation, be able to leave them not only with a foundation of an understanding of who you are, what you have done, but just one thing that's not on your resume, that's not apparent in the materials that they've already seen about you, that tells something about you in a positive fashion that they can walk away with.
Especially if you've done your homework enough to know their job description, and so you can match something in your experience that's right on with one of the line items in the job description. Again, you will blow them away with your preparation, and you will, in the process, bury the competition. A couple more things in this first 5 minutes. We've just talked about opening up the portfolio and really spreading out some documents. You're going to ask them a couple of questions. You're going to say, first of all, when something like the following: when we first set this interview up, it was for 45 minutes. Do we still have 45 minutes? Why? Because things change, and things change all the time. It may clearly be a case where you don't have 45 minutes anymore. You only have a half an hour. Or you may get a response back from the person who's interviewing that says, we got an hour and a half. This matters. One of the reasons that it matters is you need to manage the time. And partly because it's a reflection on your ability to manage your time when you get hired. Good employers want to hire people who are aware of the clock. And by the way, the old adage of it's always a good thing to go over in an interview is bunk. Can I say that? It's not true.
Yes, you can, and you just did.
It's the best interviews are those that start and stop on time. And if your interviewer says we've got an hour, then guess what you're going to do? You're going to shut down this interview on your own, by the way. You're not going to wait for the employer, because the employer is probably not nearly as good and certainly not nearly as aware as you need to be about the time.
Right.
And 5 minutes before that hour is up, you're going to shut down the interview to show them that you have your act together, that you are comfortable with getting something done in an appropriate amount of time, that you're respectful for them on needing to leave this interview and do something else, and respectful for yourself of doing the same thing. And giving yourself then that 5 minutes to wrap things up. You need to have a bookend at the end of this interview as we're talking about this 5 minutes at the front end.
I agree with everything there. I would suggest, too, that you probably want to back everything up 5 minutes. If you're expecting a 30-minute or 45-minute interview, you better be ready to be done after 30 or 35 minutes. Sure. Merely because things can, like you suggested, things can happen. And things can happen during your interview. I've been in a particular interview where I was meeting with 3 or 4 people, and phones started going off, and there was something happening that they needed to address. And so they were very respectful of the time that I had set aside, and they had set aside for me, but it was obvious that when this was over, they had stuff to take care of. And so I made sure that, we got to the points that I wanted to make from my point of view sooner than later in that particular interview, even though it was supposed to be an hour or 45 minutes. Whenever they wanted to go, I was ready to go.
Managing any meeting, whether you're an interviewee or a CEO, is always a challenge. Eric and I are suggesting that you need to take, as a job interviewee, you need to take a heightened sense of leadership on an interview meeting and make sure as you possibly can, that it starts and stops on time. A couple more quick points on this first 5 minutes. You want to ask the person their name and title and have your pen at the ready with a piece of paper that you can write down the spelling. Last item, and we're
still on the first 5 minutes.
And I'm sure the audience is thinking, Jonathan and Eric, you've been talking for 20 minutes and we're not even through the first 5 minutes. Well, understand, in practical, you'll be able to do all of this with some practice in less than 5 minutes, because that's your charge. If you really want to blow the competition away, if you want to leave the employer very impressed with you beyond your story on how well you managed what is typically a difficult kind of meeting, do these kinds of things. One more thing. Tell the employer, your future boss or HR or a whole panel, before you start the formal interview at the end of this 5 minutes, that you have questions to ask them too. Now, I'm smiling because that one statement will create a host of interesting responses.
Always been told you're going to be asked, well, do you have any questions for us? And don't say no.
Yes, and don't wait until the end, because guess what? You never have time at the end.
Right.
And so we're going to talk about this in a few minutes. But because you're going to say that at the end of the first 5 minutes, by the way, have 1 or 2 pieces of paper that has about 10 or 15 or maybe even 20 questions that you've written out. Part of them are boilerplate that you would ask any company, and some of them are specific to this company. For example, can I give one example real quick? You're going to be interviewing for companies that have struggled financially. So one of your legitimate questions to ask in the interview is, how is the company expecting to become profitable? And by the way, if you're brave and you can be good, don't say more than that. And grab your pen and pull out a piece of paper and get ready to write down what they say. Good companies will have lots of things to say about that. Bad companies will stumble badly with that question and will not have the foggiest idea what they or their boss or the CEO or investors or shareholders or anyone is going to be doing to turn the company around. That's a red flag. You get enough red flags in any interview, you should reach out your hand and say, thank you very much, but I need to move on. This is not a good fit for me.
So let's go on to the next 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes. I mean, is that the bulk of the body of the interview is when you're asked questions and you respond?
Yes. And, a bridge, an opportunity for you to close out the first 5 minutes and start the body of the interview is to say, how about if I tell you a little bit about myself? That's usually a wonderful opener. Kind of an icebreaker. And by the way, this is your 90-second elevator speech. And most good companies with good people, again, that are going places, would love it if you would spend not 40 minutes, by the way, but a well thought out minute and a half summarizing who the heck you are, even if they have taken their time to read the interview or read the resume, so they have an inkling about your background. They would love to hear it directly from you. And so one of your documents is you're going to have in your portfolio that you can either memorize, which I guess is preferred, or you can just pull it out, is your 90-second elevator speech.
So at that point, and sometimes you might not get the opportunity to do that they'll pull that out. So why don't we start with you telling us a little bit about, we have your resume here, but tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yes, it's the most common question from them, and one that often starts the formal part of the interview.
So how do we take this to, how do we lead the interview during the questioning? How are you leading the interview?
I would start off by thinking in terms of responding to each one of their questions, regardless of what they're asking, whether it's from the job description, something about the company, something about my skills, experience. I would start off, because you don't know the audience quite yet, with answering each question in about 2 sentences and then stopping. And getting into the following rhythm. Once you've answered any one of their questions, and by the way, if you have a portfolio with all these documents, there's almost nothing that they can bring up, even something from today's news, that you can't address in a couple of sentences. And then you pause and you say, Eric, is that enough? And they'll give you an indication, and it will be the same for every question, or it will be different depending on how they expected you to answer the question. And if they say, no, tell me some more, spend another sentence or 2 and try to discipline yourself that 2 sentences at a time approximately is plenty. all of the folks in the audience, for example, who are experts or experienced with Myers-Briggs will know that people who are high thinkers will be very impatient with the interview process, such that as soon as they ask you a question, they'll be looking at their notes, getting ready for the next question. So if you spend more than a sentence or two on each question, and you're sitting across someone who's a high thinker in Myers-Briggs, you will be driving them crazy because they want to move on to the next question.
Sometimes the caveat there is sometimes in some interview processes, they will they'll say, answer the question and feel free to speak at length. Mm-hmm. So that's your opportunity to perhaps go past the 2
But even
sentences.
speaking at length, a couple of minutes
Yeah, a couple of minutes.
is a long time. It is probably safe to say, Eric, that any response that you give that's more than 2 minutes to almost any question is probably too long. Certainly don't think that going on a monologue
Right.
for at length 4, 5, 6 minutes is the right thing to do.
And if you know this of yourself, that you have a tendency to tell stories that go on forever,
Some of us have that weakness, yes.
I think I'm probably guilty of that. The preparation that you do beforehand, like we talked about the STAR, situation, task, action, result, will help you be disciplined in your length and get that down to just the facts and be able to launch from there. If they want more than you've given them, that you'll be able to do it. But you've also disciplined yourself and write it for 2 minutes.
Yes, the greatest interviews are a give and take, just like Eric and I are doing here, where Eric's talking a little bit, then I'm talking about, and then I'm talking, and then Eric's talking, and I'm talking. The image of any job candidate in 2019 being grilled, and they ask a question and I respond for any length of time, is silly, nonsensical, and a sign again, a red flag sign that this probably isn't a good fit for me. This is probably a bad company. The best companies want a dialogue, a thinking man's or woman's dialogue, where Eric is asking some questions and I'm responding kind of off script in short spurts of no more than a couple minutes. And then I ask a question and it causes Eric to think and have to respond almost impromptu. Those are the best interviews, because a terrific interview that you're leading as a job candidate is one that you're trying to find fit. The employer has an opportunity. They're wondering if this job candidate can both meet the needs today and meet the needs in 5 years. And I'm trying to find out if this company is full of good people with good ideas that are going places far beyond the job description. And that takes this give and take of two people or one person in a panel of people who are thinking on their feet. You can't do that if you have no notes. You can't do that if you're not leading the conversation. And you can't do that if you are spending an enormous amount of time, 3 or 4 or 5 minutes, responding to each question. Unless the employer gives you permission, that's probably inappropriate.
We're kind of running out of time here. Any final thoughts in terms of to wrapping up the entire interview process?
Yes, the third dance, third step in this 3-step dance is the last 5 minutes. So knowing the time, again, you're going to be managing the time. Try to shut down the meeting, the interview, with about 5 minutes to go by saying something like the following. Hey, I see that we have about 5 minutes to go and I want to honor the time. Do you have any final question for me? Because I have some summary questions for you. And if the employer is concerned about time, they will abide by that and maybe ask you one more question. And then get ready for 2 or 3 things at the very end. Number one, ask them how you did. say, now that the interview is over, before we get up and say our goodbyes, ask them about the interview process. How many candidates there are, how long this process is going to take, what the next steps are for you. Why? Because as soon as you walk out, you are not likely to have any access to any information. And if you're the typical uninformed job interviewee, you'll be out of your mind, literally, in terms of what do I do now? So try to anticipate that by asking them some questions. By the way, don't be surprised if they haven't the foggiest idea what the process is. My experience, about half companies, good and bad, start an interview process before they really know what the end game is. But at least attempt to get that information. And then the last thing is, do tell them, if in fact it's sincere, that you do, for everything that you've heard and read about this company and about the job, it seems like a terrific fit. You want to leave that impression with them, stated, kind of obvious, when it's in fact true. And that will be a very positive remembrance on their part.
Any final thought?
Leading the interview is the only way to go in the 21st century. And we've tried to give you some helpful hints in the last 30, 45 minutes, and hopefully they've been helpful to you in terms of rearranging your mindset that this is no longer a grilling, but an opportunity for you to lead and show your stuff, especially in front of good employers.
And if you have any questions or want to make some statements and perhaps join the conversation, you can do so through our email, which is careertransitionspodcast@gmail.com. That's careertransitionspodcast, no spaces, at gmail.com. Jonathan, thank you so very much.
Thanks for having me, Eric.
Career Transitions is sponsored by and produced in cooperation with the Butler University Lacey School of Business graduate programs. For more information, visit butler.edu.